The first time I saw Transformers, I saw it with my then roommate, who was less, shall we say, fascinated by the Michael Bay oeuvre than I was even then. 2 days later, out of the blue, she says to me, "Did a robot pee on John Turturro in that movie?" And I was like, "No, of course not. That's ridiculous. Why would a robot pee on John Turturro?" And she was like, "No, that did happen. Bumblebee peed on John Turturro." John Turturro, Bumblebee, to repeat, In fact, I think it even had a beoing sound as its hubcap popped off before it peed on beloved India Wakan John Turturro. I was like, no, that did not happen. So, of course, I then had to see Transformers again, and I would say that, although that second viewing ultimately threw me down a rabbit hole from which I had yet to emerge, I realized something that day. Bumblebee peed on John Turturro. That was a thing that happened in that movie, and somehow I did not remember it. Years later, I have watched Transformers 3 half a dozen times, and unless I have the Wikipedia article right in front of me, I still have difficulty trying to explain the plot to you. And this isn't really so much an issue in other visually busy action movie franchises. I remember what happened in Guardians of the Galaxy both 1 and 2 pretty well, and I only saw either of those once. Which begs a question that I feel like a lot of people know is a thing, but maybe have not even really thought to ask. Why is it so difficult to remember what happens in these Thing Transformers movies? This tees into auteur theory because the answer to that question lies very much in the Bay aesthetic, the way Bay technically puts his movies together. Some characteristics of the Michael Bay aesthetic include helicopters at sunset, wide parallax, standing into the frame, helicopters at sunset, robot helicopters, street lamps, high color contrast, frequent rapid cutting, and helicopters after sunset. So if I were to point out that the frame in the Transformers movies tend to be a touch busy, I would be roughly the 9 millionth person to point that out. What I want to do is tea in that idea with the lack of impression these films make on the viewer base filmmaker ethos, and the language of film in general. So let, say you have a person talking, me for instance right now, and besides some very mild visual elements, the only information you are getting are my body language and the words that are coming out of my mouth. So let's add to that a big block of text that has nothing to do with what I am saying right now. You can either listen to me and what I'm saying, or you can read the block of text. I mean, you could try to do both. But now you reworking twice as hard to try to absorb whatever is coming at you. And you can maybe listen to me and read the block of text and actually absorb what is saying, but your ability for it to stick with you is diminished. The same applies to film language. Your human brain has only so much processing power and has to be absorbing film language information just as much as dialogue information. And if the film makes you work too hard to absorb that information, your brain is going to get tired and frustrated by that pretty quickly. If the information is too cluttered or too quick, you just won't absorb it, but too slow, and it likes excitement, and then you get bored. This is why editing and framing are much more integral aspects of film language than dialogue. In terms of sheer information, where we are in time, what the tone is, what is even happening, You get far more raw information than the words coming out of the actor's mouth from film language. Film language is all-encompassing. Everything you see on screen uses film language, even if it's just pure blackness. Much that once was is lost. Or whiteness. All of this tells your brain something, even if the something is just the concept of the color white. Okay, I know white's not a color. Now let's add something else. Maybe some reverb on me voice and some angelic music. Even combining the very simplest of elements in a frame can create a form of shorthand. Maybe I am dead, and talking about film language from the beyond. Maybe I am God. Maybe God is dead. Transformers. The nuances of film language would be impossible to list because new ones are being developed literally every day. Film language is extremely fluid. But simply put, all elements of the film, from the frame to the dialogue to the editing, to the acting, all of these things convey information to the audience. And some frames, by necessity, are more impactful than others. To borrow once again from Every Frame a Painting's episode on Bayhem, Michael Bay tends not only to maximize visual impact in important shots, shots that convey crucial plot information, but maximizes visual impact in every shot. Bay's aesthetic is a series of dynamic shots and no non-dynamic ones. So rather than a visual intensity rising and falling as the story goes, the visuals in Michael Bay's movies hang around a 9 or a 10, meaning that every frame is telling you that this information is of max importance and therefore it is harder to retain it. Let's talk about visual contrast and affinity and its impact on what the audience absorbs, be it with cinematography, editing, sound, lighting. You have contrast and you have affinity. Affinity means similarity. Contrast means contrast. A general rule of thumb. Contrast is generally more striking and therefore more impactful. Affinity is less striking and therefore less impactful. That does not mean that one is better than the other. In fact, you need both in order to make a coherent film. Let's look at a scene from Psycho. In this scene, Norman is giving Marion a sandwich. Norman is attracted to Marion, but has a lot of shame in the form of the mother personality. This is an important scene because at the end of it, Marion decides that she needs to leave and go back to her real life and own up to the consequences of what she's done. It's a very long dialogue scene with a lot of shot reverse shot. Maximum viewer impact happens upon the first time you see a shot. This is why shot reverse shot gets kind of dull if the frame never changes. And this is also why changing the shots needs to be motivated. The frame on Norman changes when Marion challenges the idea of Norman's mother. We go from a more conventional frame to a frame with more tonal contrast, that is more pronounced blacks and whites, and also with a bird of doom in the background. And it changes again when Marion suggests that Norman institutionalized his mother and he turns on her. The frame changes when the beat and tone of the scene change and the tension builds. I use the example of Psycho because the changes in the frame are highly motivated. After a long stretch of visual affinity, the visual contrast of the new frame tells the viewer that this is an important shift and needs to be remembered. Bay understands that the more times you cut back to the same frame, you lose some tension, which is why you so rarely see a cut back and forth to the same frame in a Michael Bay movie. His camera is always moving, he rarely uses traditional shot reverse shot, and he rarely cuts back to the same frame. Visual contrast can be off tone, off hue, off movement, but in editing, when the focus falls in the same place from shot to shot, that is called affinity of continuum of movement. When this then the move I love you. I love you. Constructed to the mouth Haven't I seen you before? Maybe. When the focus falls into different places from shot to shot, that is called contrast of continuum of movement. You may have heard of the centering technique used in Mad Max Fury Road. The cinematographer deliberately kept the action in the center of the shot during the action scenes, so editor Margaret Sixel would have maximum temporal freedom in the edit, meaning she could make the shots go for as long or as short as she desired. And she had that freedom because the focus is always in the same place from shot to shot, the center of the frame. This is a good example of affinity of continuum of movement. The continuum of movement is that this is a good example of affinity of continuum of movement. The continuum of movement in Transformers action scenes kind of goes back and forth. Sometimes there is excellent affinity of continuum of movement, and sometimes there's a lot of contrast. That is not to say that contrast of continuum of movement in action scenes is always a bad thing when it is used deliberately. There is a scene in Batman Begins where the Batman uses Scarecrow's scare tactics against him, and it's really hard to follow what's going on in the scene. Where's there's the where where well, yeah, you see, oh, yeah, yeah, you see, oh, yeah, 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 you will, you see, oh, see, does you see, oh, you see, This scene is made to be intentionally disorienting, to give some menace to Batman, as we see him from the point of view of the criminal. But it is important to know also that this is not consistent with the rest of the visual style of the film. This style of editing is used very rarely, therefore it is memorable when it does happen. Most of the film is shot very traditionally, so when you do have a scene that deliberately uses a lot of contrast of continuum of movement, not only does the audience remember the scene, the intended effect helps the audience remember the scene rather than diminishes your ability to do so. Here's an example of rapid fire cutting and contrast of continuum of movement to create a desired effect. In the Transformers movies, especially the later ones, there's little focus of where the eye is supposed to be, especially when the robots are on screen. So when you combine visually confusing character design, no clear focus in the frame, the rapid-fire nature of the cutting, and contrast of continuum of movement, eventually your brain is just going to kind of tune out and sit back and enjoy the spectacle. It's like a fireworks show you only half paying attention to because you looking at your phone. And that is what some people are here for. That is what a lot of people are here for. But the visual language makes no distinction between what is important and what isn't. And while loud and noisome, its homogeneity in the form of being loud and noisome makes it difficult to absorb what is even going on. The way your eye moves takes brain processing power. The more your eye has to move around, the more work your brain has to do, the less information you are able to absorb. And again, this is not inherently a bad technique when the intent is motivated. And this is also not to say that Bay never slows down or focuses his frame. Again, this is part of why the first half of the first movie, I argue, is the strongest, because it takes the time to set up important plot points visually. And the plot point of Sam's glasses, dumb as it is, at least you remember that's what the Autobots are interested in and why Sam matters. Take note, audience, extreme close-up staying on the glasses means you need to remember the glasses. Therefore you remember the glasses. And I cannot say the same for the pillars in Transformers 3 or the whatever the problem was in Transformers 2 or 4. Transformium. How are you in every movie, Stanley Tuxi? So as the films progress, when there is a relatively important piece of plot information being imparted, the language of the film does not tell your brain, this is important and you need to remember this. Or it doesn't sink in because every shot is given equal weight visually. The focus on visual spectacle increases and the editing gets sloppier. I want to pay special attention to the sequence in Dark of the Moon. Here we have two conflicting elements of film language. Shi acting is in direct contradiction with the editing. His screaming is supposed to be humorous, but there is no time for the joke to land. There is no like moment where Bumblebee kind of playfully rips in with like a pop song or something. No moment where the audience is allowed to take a breath and collect itself before the next action sequence starts. No moment where Sam composes himself. He screams, the emotion of it has no time to land, and then the film cuts to the next scene. And the thing is, action scenes are uniquely hard to edit. Rapid cutting means the cuts need to match where the A was on a previous cut. You having to work to figure out where the focus is in the new cut means your brain can't absorb information because it's too busy trying to figure out where to look. I wanted to incorporate the episode on film language into the greater discussion of auteur theory because this discussion is somewhat unique to Michael Bay and also rubs up against the greater thesis of this entire series, which is that the text of the film rubs up and often conflicts against the framing. And I hear you saying text. What text? And yes, these movies have plots and stories, and they are convoluted as hell, and the director seems largely uninterested in the story and therefore does not create frames that complement the story, but rather creates frames designed for maximum spectacle. And spectacle is great if it is used with purpose, and if your film is all spectacle with no focus, then your audience is going to have a difficult time remembering which information is important to the plot and which information isn't.